In our final story for this edition of the Rolling Stone, something a little different, actually, because it's about the coronavirus, right? It's been spreading. There are 80,000 cases worldwide now. Everyone is on edge. Everyone is saying that it's going to come to America, might become an epidemic. It's just a question of when. In fact, the state of California has declared a state of emergency in San Francisco for the coronavirus. So, in light of all this, President Trump this past week held a press conference about the virus, and he appointed Vice President Mike Pence to head up the coronavirus response team. Okay? Now, of course, I mean, first of all, let me just say that Trump could have resurrected, I don't know, Albert Einstein or something. And I know Einstein wasn't a bacteriologist, he wasn't a virologist or anything like that. But Einstein is just, a scientific genius, and we all know. Yes, I know that he was a physicist, and he wasn't a virologist or a bacteriologist or anything like that. But let's just go with the example, okay? Trump could have resurrected right there in the Rose Garden. Could have resurrected, brought Einstein back from the dead, and appointed him the head of the response team, and people still would have had a problem with it. I don't know what those problems would have been, but they would have they would have taken right immediately to the microphones, to their blogs, to their websites to say, this is the most horrible decision Trump could make. He wants Americans to die. Okay? So it's not surprising that people were critiquing, is the polite term for it, his decision to put VP Pence in charge of this response team. But it went further than that, because people were attacking Pence. Because apparently when he was the governor of Indiana, there was an outbreak of HIV and hepatitis C, which everyone said was perfectly preventable, but which was allowed to spread because of Pence's faith. Okay? So one of our favorite people here on the Stone, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she said on Twitter, quote, Mike Pence literally does not believe in science. It is utterly irresponsible to put him in charge of U.S. coronavirus response as the world sits on the cusp of a pandemic. This decision could cost people their lives. Pence's past decisions already have. As governor, Pence's science denial contributed to one of the worst HIV outbreaks in Indiana's history. He is not a medical doctor. He is not a health expert. He is not qualified nor positioned in any way to protect our public health. And Sanders, Bernie Sanders, that is, also took to Twitter and kind of built on his acolytes' condemnation by saying that when that HIV hepatitis C outbreak happened in Indiana in 2015 when Pence was governor, Pence's remedy for that was to quote-unquote pray the HIV away, which is, a not unsubtle jab at the stereotype of evangelical Christians of praying the gay away, right? That's not a coincidence that Sanders phrased it the way that he did. And this was the theme from Vox and Slate to the New York Times and USA Today, that Pence was completely unworthy of being put in charge of this coronavirus response team because he quote-unquote does not believe in science. And as proof of that, we have everyone pointed to the outbreak of the HIV and hepatitis C. Well, what happened then? Let's get some things straight here, okay? In the first place, it should be noted that no, Pence isn't a doctor. He isn't a medical expert, but he's not being asked to develop a cure for the virus. He's not being asked to write a scientific paper or anything. He's managing a team. He's managing scientists. and probably a whole bunch of other people. Okay, he's basically just the point of contact for all these people and saying, okay, let's go in this direction, let's go in this direction. Okay, so the fact that he's not a doctor doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with anything. Now, what about this outbreak of HIV and hepatitis C that everyone keeps talking about? Well, in 2015, in southern Indiana, there was an outbreak of HIV and hepatitis C because drug users were actually sharing needles with each other, right? So someone who had HIV, hepatitis C, fueled up on drugs, right? And then he shared his needle with another drug user, right? And so the diseases kept spreading because then they would share that needle. That needle would go around and around and around. And every time someone used it, right, they would get infected with HIV or hepatitis C. Medical experts, okay, they told Pence, after it became apparent that something was wrong, that, oh gosh, there are too many HIV, hepatitis C cases happening in this area, and they figured out, well, it's because all these drug users are sharing infected needles. They said that, well, the way to stop this is to have a needle exchange program where drug dealers could actually go to designated areas and get clean needles so that they could shoot up safely without the risk of getting HIV or hepatitis C. Pence was adamantly against needle exchange programs on principle because he said needle exchange programs, they basically just encourage more drug use. Okay? They actually encourage people to get drugs because it's like the state is saying, yeah, we know that you're taking drugs and that's really, really bad, but you know what? Here's a clean needle for you anyway. Okay? That's why Pence was against it. Now, he eventually did greenlight a needle exchange program, okay, for the sole purpose of getting rid of this epidemic of HIV and hepatitis C. And, okay, just for future reference, that is what he said that he was going to pray over. Unlike what Bernie Sanders said, Pence never said that he was going to pray for the HIV to go away. Okay, he never said that he was going to pray the HIV away. He said that he was going to pray over whether he should okay a needle exchange program for this situation, even though it was against his principles and against what he believed when it came to fighting the opioid epidemic and the drug war in and of itself. So Bernie Sanders lied there, but he's a socialist, so what are you going to expect, okay? Now, multiple people, and this is where you get the narrative, the claim that Pence caused this outburst, this outbreak in southern Indiana, right? Because if he had relied on the science, if he had relied on those experts telling him to start a needle exchange program instead of relying on his faith, then that outbreak wouldn't have been nearly as bad. Because at the end of it, at its height, I think 200 people were infected with HIV. Okay? The first problem is that yes, a lot of studies seem to suggest that having a needle exchange program does lower that risk, but it is not infallible. We just have to look to Vancouver, Canada to see that, okay? Because Vancouver started a needle exchange program in the late 80s, right? Now, I'm quoting from a piece from the Federalist here, which ran in 2017, which talked about the Vancouver's experiment with a needle exchange program. Okay, quote: "The estimated HIV prevalence in Vancouver was only 2% among the city's population of 6,000 to 10,000 injecting drug users. The advocates of this needle exchange, much like their Hoosier counterparts, believed it would increase HIV rates, that it would decrease HIV rates. Just the opposite occurred. Both HIV and hepatitis C exploded among the drug-using population, according to a study published in July 2003. The HIV rate had risen to 35%, one of the highest incidence rates reported worldwide. The Vancouver study also recorded a rate of hepatitis at an astonishing 82%. Okay? So while a lot of studies do seem to suggest that needle exchange programs lower the risk of HIV and hepatitis C among drug users, it's not infallible. Okay? It doesn't always work. Therefore, all right, Mike Pence was not putting his faith above science in that particular case. Okay? That's number one. Number two here is that people obsessing over needle exchange programs, all right, forget that people, okay, are not denying science when they say that they don't want needle exchange programs, but they just don't want to encourage people to have drugs, because having a needle exchange program does not get rid of the fundamental problem, which is people taking drugs. That's number two. Number three, okay, is this. What exactly is wrong with praying? People were getting after Mike Pence for saying that, when he was governor, that he was going to pray over whether to start a needle exchange program. People were actually getting upset with him for praying instead of just trusting in the science. But everyone knows that Mike Pence is a believer in Christianity. Everyone knows that he is actually a genuine Christian believer, which means he puts his money where his mouth is. He doesn't just say he believes in the premises and the tenets and the principles and the creeds. Actually, if we get right down to it, of Christianity, he actually does believe them. And he acts them out in his real life, which incidentally is one reason why so many people hate him, because he's not a hypocrite. Okay? So really, what is the problem? What is the problem of prayer? What is this problem? We've seen this before too. Whenever now there is a mass shooting, right? Whether here in the US or somewhere in Europe or anywhere, people on the left now are very quick to say, keep your prayers and thoughts to yourself. They don't do a damn thing, right? If you're just going to offer thoughts and prayers, but you're not actually going to work for gun control and actually work for real solutions that will save people's lives, then just shut up. You're part of the problem. What is this malignant disdain for prayer, right? Because even if you yourself are not a believer, you should at the very least respect people who say, I am going to pray over this, right? Because that's their belief. And it is a sincere belief when they say, I will pray for you, or something like that. I will pray over this. I'm going to pray for this situation. That's coming from a very deep place in their souls and their hearts. So what's the problem for the left with prayer? The problem is that, once again, it undermines their own authority. We've talked about this before. I have harped about this before, but I will repeat myself here. The left's ultimate goal is to create utopia here on Earth. That's why, they have their intersectionality. That's why they cling to it. That's why they are devoted to taking over the culture and taking over politics as much as possible so that they can actually create utopia here on Earth. Well, what does prayer do? Prayer flies right in the face of that, because prayer means that somewhere, out there, somewhere, is a god or gods of some sort. Because if there wasn't, then there would be no need for prayer, right? What that also means, right, is that there is an afterlife of some kind. If there is a God, there is an afterlife. Even untraditional religions like Buddhism have an afterlife of some sort, nirvana, right? That's what the ultimate goal is for Buddhists, nirvana. So if there is a God to whom your prayers are directed, and if there is also an afterlife, the two always really go together, God and afterlife, then what does that mean? Well, that means that there is something higher than your ideology, something higher than your dream of utopia, which means that there is something to which people could actually give their allegiance to before you. In fact, there is something or someone out there to whom they should and are required to actually give their allegiance to before you in your ideology, in your dream of utopia. But not only that, it means that you cannot create utopia here on earth, because if perfection is out there, right, part of God or the gods, part of that afterlife, then it makes absolutely no sense to try to take that heaven and to put it down here on this very flawed, very fallen earth. That's the reason why that they are so terrified. They get so angry at the very thought of people actually praying. That's why they get so mad. And there's one other thing. This leads to the second point, where this contradiction between faith and reason was being played out again by AOC and Bernie Sanders, right? Saying that Mike Pence chose his faith over science. That disgusting, that disgusting pig allowing people to die because he chose his faith over science. Here's the thing. So that very much implies that, faith, reason, and never the twain shall meet, right? It's like separation of church and state for them. Kind of, sort of, because while religion can't tell the government what to do, government can sure as hell tell religions what to do. Or at least a religion if it begins with a C and has Christianity in it. But here's the thing. Faith and reason are not contradictory. They're not contradictory at all, okay? Let's just say that there is a God out there. A God who made everything, the entire cosmos, including the earth and everyone who's on it, okay? Not necessarily the Christian God, okay? Just God, a supreme being, okay? If that is the case, then it does not make any sense to say that faith and reason are contradictory, because that supreme being who created the cosmos, including the earth and humanity and everything else, created our human nature, which has rationality, and which also has this deep-seated, deep-rooted urge, desire, need to worship something above and beyond itself. That's just a fact of life. There are no natural atheistic societies, and even when a society is artificially made atheistic, like the USSR, you have to replace the belief in God, the belief in a church, with something else. In the USSR's case, right, they replaced God with itself. The state became God. The party became the church. Heaven became the new Soviet man, etc., right? So, if that's the case, we have rationality and we have this overwhelming urge to worship something, right? They're both inside of us. If we are created by a supreme being who made our natures, then rationality and that urge, that desire to worship, comes from the same source. So it can't be contradictory, okay? We can show this again. We look at the long list of philosophers who were religious, but who were also rational men, right? We think of Augustine, we think of Thomas Aquinas, we think of Jacques Maritain, we think of Blaise Pascal, we think of Kierkegaard, we think of Immanuel Kant, we think of Leibniz, we think of Muslim philosophers too, like Averroes, etc. We think of all of these people, and you see that just because you are the smartest person in your town, the smartest person perhaps of your age, that doesn't mean that you cannot be a man of very deep faith. And on the opposite side, you see that just because you are a man of deep faith, it doesn't mean that you're the country idiot who doesn't know anything about science. Louis Pasteur, for example. Louis Pasteur, the man who invented pasteurization, saved millions and millions of lives, was a devoted Catholic who said a rosary every day. In fact, that there's a story of Louis Pasteur where this young French atheist, saw a man on the train, silently praying a rosary, and he started just kind of, making kind of fun of him, saying, "You don't know what's going on. There ain't no God up there. You need to put your faith in science and look at, for example, the wonderful, cures and processes that are being discovered every day in this marvelous 19th century we're living in. Well, just look at Louis Pasteur. He didn't make any of his discoveries by looking into the Bible or praying or anything. You need to be more like him." And of course, I'm sure, as you know, because you probably saw this twist coming the moment I started telling the story, that guy turned out to be Louis Pasteur. Right? So, there is no contradiction between faith and reason. None whatsoever. There is only the contradiction when ideologues redefine faith and reason to push their own narrative. Okay? Ideologues, especially today on the postmodern left, both here in America and in Europe, are very, very good at redefining things. We've talked about that numerous times here before on The Stone. And that is the only time when faith and reason become contradictory, not only to themselves, but also to reality around themselves. Because, of course, again, they are not what they should be anymore. They have simply been appropriated. I will use that word, appropriated, by the left for their own agenda, which means their natures have been left by the wayside and they've just been given this horrible, shallow, zombie nature to get whatever the ideologues want. That is the only case when faith and reason are actually contradictory. But again, that is the only way when ideologues actually are comfortable with faith and logic, because the thing about faith and logic is that they are very stubborn things, and that more often than not, they will point to things that ideologues do not want to admit, whether it's a natural hierarchy, whether it's biology and biological differences, whether it's sexual ethics, etc., etc. The ideologues do not want to admit the truth of those things. Again, those things are rivals for their power. They're rivals. And therefore, they either have to be shut out completely from society, or they effectively have to be neutered by being redefined. But anyway, gang, I have spoken far too long, as is my unfortunate habit here. So I will wrap things up by saying, take care, have a very happy, very great leap day, and I will chat at y'all later, gang. Ciao!